Hello and welcome to Dish Shelved with Adam White. This is our final installment of June on the Range. Today I'm going to be talking about The Lone Ranger and the Mystery Ranch by Fran Stryker. That Fran Stryker was the creator of The Lone Ranger. It was originally a radio show that ran for a few years before they started doing. He appeared in a few pulp magazines, and then he started appearing in novels. And this one was originally, 1938. This edition was a first edition in 1975 when they republished them. You can see it's a little beat up. Uh, the Lone Ranger and Tonto are partners, which is evident through the interaction in the story between the two of them. Uh, Despite some stuff that, of course, is a product of its time in terms of how Tonto speaks uh, and just how he's treated, sort of in a certain way. I'll tell you what this story's about. The Lone Ranger rides again, and this the second story in the series. It's volume number 2, which you can't really see, but uh, it's a second story. I couldn't find volume 1. Been out of print for a while. The Lone Ranger and Tonto ride into the midst of a murderous riddle. A dead man and talk of a missing piece of a map to a fortune in gold are the only clues. However, a vicious gang of outlaws known as the Night Legion has been terrorizing the area, also in quest for the map. It seems obvious they are responsible for the killing. Then suddenly, more violence and killing shatter the peaceful valley. 2 deputies are shot in cold blood. Into this bullet-torn scene, 2 lovely young girls arrive by stagecoach to visit the Whitcomb Ranch, and soon the ranch becomes the mysterious focus of a deadly war between the Night Legion and Sheriff Cook's badly outnumbered men. But 2 other men would make the difference: the Lone Ranger and Tonto. Now, as I said, there is some stuff in here that is a product of its time. Yeah. Ironically, the sticker here on the front is stuck over Tonto's head, which kind of shows what they think of him speaking. I'll read you how the story starts out. Um, Through the night, 2 men moved at a slow gait. Their horses were 2 silver-white blobs without a definite outline 10 yards distant. The men sat on their horses with an easy grace, but the constant vigilance of those whose life might be forfeit for a moment's relaxation. The smaller of the men had the bronzed, high cheekbone face of an Indian. His long black hair was parted in the center of his head and drawn back tightly to be fashioned into a war knot at the back of his neck. The Indian's name was Tonto, and he was the faithful friend and ally of the most mysterious figure ever to ride the plains and prairies or roam the woods and mountains of the West. He was known as the Lone Ranger. "Maybe we find 'em place for camp soon," he said. Yeah, that's the kind of things you see. And Tonto nodded grimly, still somewhat angry with himself for what he considered laziness and oversleeping darkness. "Plenty lawmen hunt 'em clue," he muttered. "No one find 'em." Yeah, so there's definitely some dated take on Native Americans in this, and their ability to speak proper English, because in the text of the story, you really get a sense that Tonto is very smart and very capable, such as here. The Lone Ranger didn't underestimate his adversary's power. He was fully aware of the fact that the boss of the Night Legion, he was pitted against the coldest, shrewdest, most calculating, and by far most ruthless enemy of law and order the West had ever known. A man was the leader of other men, a dominating king whose lawless band and one who was totally unknown even to his most trusted lieutenants. Yet in Tonto, the Lone Ranger had an ally whose skill in reading trail signs and interpreting the most insignificant mark on the ground and in following a spoor was unsurpassed. Tonto would prove a tower of strength in any fight, and Tonto, he knew, would gladly lay down his life at any time for the cause of justice or for the Lone Ranger. He was counting on Tonto more than the Indian realized in making this return trip to the clearing. During the hand-to-hand battle of 2 nights before, he saw something Tonto had been too occupied to notice. He noticed the only man the outlaws who was hooded making his escape. He knew after discussing events with Tonto later that this man was the boss. He recalled the exact place the boss had left the camp and went to fight. There must be footprints there. One single footprint would be enough for Tonto. Having seen it, studied it, and measured it, the Indian would never forget it. One print might be all they needed to identify the leader of the Night Legion. You get in that little section right there, as well as other sections too, that Tonto's very capable and very smart and an excellent tracker. There's plenty other times where they tell of him talking to the Lone Ranger about certain things that he knows, but they just describe him and say that he says these things, and they don't focus on the very poor dialogue that they've given him when he does speak in the book. So he does get respect as a character in the text of the book. It's just the dialogue that really shows the time of its making, which was 1938. So, but it was written by the original creator of the character in the radio show, and it was a pretty good book. I saved it for last because I love the Lone Ranger. I always have, and I figured it would probably be a favorite of mine in the westerns that I read. Uh, the It turns out the last book that I did, The Outlaw Marshal, that was really my favorite, as I stated in that video, and it it really was my favorite of the bunch. But this was a pretty good book. The only issue that I have with it, other than the treatment of the Indian dialogue in it, uh, is that the Lone Ranger and Tonto are kind of tertiary characters in it. It reminded me a lot of the first novel of The Shadow, The Living Shadow, I think it was called, uh, where you deal mostly with the Shadow's agents and their hunt for the bad guy, and uh, you just get a sense of the Shadow and what he does every once in a while. I got the same kind of vibe from this one. You followed the bad guys. I mean, even though you didn't know who the boss was, the main bad guy, until the very end. Uh, and it does turn out kind of in a surprising way. Because you think it's going one way, but then they pull a little twist at the end. Uh, and But the Lone Ranger and Tonto just show up every once in a while. They start in later on in the story with the sheriff and his deputies, and they kind of follow them around. They follow the two girls around, Marge and Sally, that are two young women who are coming to live with their uncle on the Whitcomb Ranch, and they follow them around. They encounter the Lone Ranger. Uh, but then there's more of it about them than there is about him, the Lone Ranger and Tonto. So that's one thing that I had that I would have liked to have a little more of the Lone Ranger and Tonto in it. That's what brought me to the book. That's what I wanted to read. And you just get them in small helpings in the book. So that was a little unfortunate. Something else that I thought I saw in the middle of this book well, if I can find it now. Um, I saw that there was a little, like a collar page in the middle. I thought, oh, great, this has got like a art print or something of the Lone Ranger. No, it's a cigarette advertisement. Come for the filter, you'll stay for the taste. Now, this was 1975, and you know the Lone Ranger is going to be marketed towards younger people. And yet, in the middle of it, you've got a cigarette ad. Okay, that really does me in on that, which shows you the shamelessness at the time of how young they were trying to get people hooked on smoking. But I thought, well, here I was thinking I was going to get an art print in the middle of it, and instead I get a cigarette ad. So, something thankfully we no longer have to deal with. But I guess that was commonplace in books. But like I said, this was aimed at younger readers, and um, I just find it kind of shameless that there would be a cigarette advertisement in the middle of this book. Now, like I said, overall, I still like the book, even though I would have liked a little more Lone Ranger and Tonto in it. I'm not saying they weren't in it at all, they were in it some, but they were definitely tertiary characters compared to the other ones in it. You got to see them through the eyes of other people, kind of the same way you saw the Shadow in his first adventure. Which I don't think I've talked about the Shadow, but I've read it and I really enjoy the Shadow too. I've read one of the Lone Ranger's pulp magazine stories. It was really good. Matter of fact, I liked it better than this because it did focus on the Lone Ranger in it. I don't remember what it was called, and I don't have it handy where I can get to it. I have a few more of the pulp editions, the reprint pulp editions of the Lone Ranger, and you can get those digitally from a site called radioarchives.com. They sell cheap for like $3-4 pulp magazine replicas digitally, and that's a good way to get them cheap. And they've got all the Lone Ranger ones that there are on them, which is where I'll get my next ones. The few I've got in print. That was before I knew about those. But so I definitely recommend reading stuff of the Lone Ranger. Uh, he's a classic Western icon, and uh, just I really enjoy it. I mean, he's a superhero of the Old West, and just a really great character that I really enjoy. There's also been lots of comics done on him, and TV shows and movies, and all to various degrees of worth. But and then of course his original radio shows. But I really recommend looking up the Lone Ranger and reading something to do with the Lone Ranger. Now, this is the last episode of June on the Range, and I just want to say I've had a great time doing it, and that really enjoyed reading some westerns. I'm looking forward to reading more westerns now that I've done this, and you will probably see some in the future from me, but probably not for a while. I'll probably move on. Uh, Next month for July, I'm going to do Sci Fi July. I decided to do another theme. I'm going to read some older science fiction novels, and that will be what I talk about mainly during July. And then I'll also have some plans later on in August, but I got to wait and see if they come to fruition first. But anyway, I've had a great time with June on the Range. Thank you to Michael K. Vaughn for coming up with it. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks for hanging out with me this week, and I'll see you guys in a week.